So just to welcome you to the third in our series of dairy extension webinars here at the University of Illinois. Um, Today we're going to talk about strategies to get cows pregnant, look at some issues that at least that's faced the University of Illinois herd, and see how we've done as far as implementing a strategic reproductive program to get cows pregnant. So let's go ahead and launch into today's presentation. Hopefully everybody that's logging in has received the PDF file by email. I sent that out earlier this morning, so you can follow along on the printed copy if you want. And then this series will also be posted on the website, so you can actually come back and listen to it again if you really just can't get enough of us. So welcome everybody, and let's get rolling. I guess the first thing that I'd like to try and define is how do people define reproductive success? Because each farm's going to have a different definition of when our reproductive program is being quote unquote successful. And I guess I would define success as how efficiently are you getting cows pregnant when you want them to be pregnant. And I say it that way because some farms choose that, I don't want my cows pregnant until they're in their 120 days in milk. So that's their choice on when they want them to be pregnant. And the question is, how efficiently are you getting them pregnant by that date and time? Most farms are using somewhere around a 50, 60, 70-day voluntary waiting period, so that's when the earliest they would start to get them pregnant. And I think we all realize that you're not going to get every single cow pregnant the first time you breed her. So those are part of the things that we need to deal with the efficiencies of getting cows pregnant. So to take that, we need to sort of go back and define efficiently. And that's performing in the best possible manner with the least waste of supplies, time, and effort. And I've kind of modified that definition a little bit as we look at reproduction, because the least waste of supplies would imply not only semen, but also if you're using reproductive hormones and you have the labor to give those injections and the effort to do that, we want to do that as efficiently as possible so that we're not wasting time, effort, and then resources, which labor is actually a fairly huge resource on many farms. What are some of the bottlenecks to achieving efficient reproduction on farms? Well, certainly there is some variability in what we say may be the voluntary waiting period. So some farms choose an earlier voluntary waiting period, some choose a later one. There are some good reasons to choose, say, 80-day voluntary waiting period, because the cow has had more opportunities for an estrus cycle. The more estrus cycles a cow has before we breed her the first time, we're fairly confident in the research that says they're more fertile, and we'll see higher pregnancy rates on that first service if they've had more estrus cycles. So that days in milk, or the DIMFS, which is days in milk at first service, that's going to be varied based on whether we're using a heat detection program or whether we're using a time breeding program where there's going to be cows are going to be serviced on a time factor. So that SR is what we're going to call service rate, and some people call that heat detection rate. And there's been some discussions lately, I know, on the AABPL, the listserv that the veterinarians for the bovine practitioners have, on whether we should be looking back more at heat detection. And I find it interesting that a lot of veterinarians that recommend only heat detection, or we should be doing a better job heat detection, probably have not run their own dairies, because heat detection is a very labor it does take a lot of labor, a lot of time, a lot of effort if you're going to do it right, do it properly. And then we have the other issue that it seems to me that at least Holstein cows in our current modern systems don't show good estrus. And whether it's that we're not there at the time that they're showing the heats, or whether it is a factor of milk production. And if you look at some of Milo Wiltbank's work, some of the effect on reproductive hormones through metabolic activity, we're having some issues obviously getting cows to show estrus. We have pedometers on our cows at the university herd, and even at times that is not efficient enough for us to be able to really adequately say, yes, that cow came into heat. And then finally, there's variability in conception rate. We all know that different people do a better job breeding cows, and I see one of our breeders is here on the list on the webinar today. So he's one of our farm breeders. He also happens to be a second-year vet student, and so conception rate is really important, and he's doing a fantastic job for us getting cows pregnant. So with the cows that we offer him, as long as they're in heat, he does a pretty good job getting them pregnant. And that's going to have some variability as well. So variability is what really we're focusing on. Is to achieve efficient reproduction, we need to have less variability at each of these factors. Now, certainly diseases, both metabolic and infectious, can have an impact on fertility as well. And we're not going to really focus on the effects of, say, ketosis in reproduction. We know that some work out of Canada has shown us that there's a big impact on reproduction with cows that have ketosis. So metabolic diseases, and obviously infectious diseases such as lepto and BVD, Neospora, and some others are going to have an impact on efficient fertility in a herd. And so it's important that we keep those in mind as other bottlenecks. But what we really want to focus on today are the issues of variability, and variability in some of the parameters that we use to monitor reproduction. Okay, so with that as an introduction to sort of how we're going to approach today's webinar, what I want to do is sort of show you a history of the U of I's reproductive parameters. Now, this top blue, lighter blue line is the days open, or days from calving to conception, from 1998, or basically January of 1999, all the way through pretty much the current months here. And actually, I kind of ended it December of 2009, so it has 3 more months added onto it if you want to add in January, February, March of this year. The green line then is the days in milk at first service for the herd. And so you can see that there's been some changes over time and how we've sort of fit this in. From the time that I started recording these records, January of 1999, up until the end of that orange arrow, we were primarily using heat detection for all services. It wasn't until we started using synchronized services with his Precinct and Offsync, followed by a resync program in 33 days, that we actually saw more volatility in our days open. Now, obviously, at the university herd, we can play around with the cows a little bit more. Maybe we don't want to always do that, but on the other hand, that's one of the things that we do in research settings, is we have the ability, or at least sometimes even the desire, to go ahead and look at some different systems. But one of the things we had problems with is actually at the end of the time when we stopped using all heat detection, is you see that the days open climbed pretty dramatically. And then it dropped fairly drastically. And some of that has to do with actually getting some of those late lactation cows pregnant. So we had some cows that were pretty long in milk that finally got pregnant. And there were some other issues that led to us using a synchronization program in the herd at that point in time. But then there's another point in time where actually we saw a pretty large increase in the days open. Actually, it got up the highest it's ever been, up at 190 days for the herd. And you'll notice that there's also a coinciding increase in the days to first service. So again, this was some of the things where we were trying to do some different things in the herd. I want to talk a little bit about what's happened over that time. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the data in the yellow, basically, from when we started our synchronization programs and the different programs that we put the cows through as we walk through that. Now, many of you probably have seen some of these scatter plots, but this is a scatter plot of days in milk at first breeding by calving date. And so this was at the middle to the end of 2002. And at that point in time, we were primarily using estrus detection. Now, you'll notice in the upper right corner, there's the portion of the graph that we're actually looking at. Is that portion right up there in that upper right corner of that previous historical graph. So this is all the yellow, or the red dots are second lactation, and the blue triangles then are first lactation animals. You'll notice that we actually had one cow that we bred at about 20 days in milk. This cow down here at the bottom, we had another heifer up here that she didn't get her first service till she was 182. And this is the kind of variability that you deal with when you're using a heat detection approach, because not all cows come into heat at the same time. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in days in milk at first service. And we were struggling along there at about 150 days open in the herd, not really getting any better, not really getting any worse. I got the yellow line in there as that was our voluntary waiting period, at least what we listed on DHI. You'll notice that probably about 45 days was actually the true voluntary waiting period, with a few cows that got bred earlier than that. Okay, so that's the basis of where we started with, and that's sort of when we started a synchronization program. 2 years after being in the synchronization program, you'll be able to see as we move across the line now, this is the area of that previous graph where you saw the days open really dropping down to, actually it ended up being about 115 days open was the lowest it ever had hit at its nadir. You also see that the days to first service on average had dropped into that 70-day range and pretty consistently down around 70 days. And this is a typical pattern you'll see in herds that are using synchronization-based programs for first service. You notice that we basically set cows up so that their first service wouldn't occur any earlier than 60 days in milk. And with that, you had a coinciding drop in days open. So some would say that that was a more successful program, even though it required obviously quite a bit more hormone input into the herd, GnRH and prostaglandin, to get the cows to the point where we could get them serviced. I'm going to move on over to that 2007 area where you started to see the average days open in the herd increase and a coincident increase, as you would expect, in days open because we waited longer to breed cows. And actually, interesting to note here, we attempted then to move into what I think most people call the cherry picking program, where we actually bred cows off of the prostaglandin shots, but they didn't get their first precinct shots until they would have their first heat around 60 days. And so some of these early heats here were cows that had heat off the first prostaglandin injection. And then, about 80 days, they got their second injection, and that's when we started seeing the second heats. And after that, then they were off-synced if they didn't show heat off of two breeding programs. But notice that we introduced variability, and obviously the reason days open increases is because, again, days to first service increased almost 110 days average. So this is obviously some issues, and we weren't getting cows pregnant the way that we wanted them to, at least what we called success. Success for us was getting cows pregnant between 85 and 115 days in milk, and we weren't getting that done. And then I'll get to your question here in a minute, Phil. Well, let me finish with these series of scatter plots. So then as we move further to the right on the days open graph and the days to first service graph, you'll notice that there was a very drastic decline in days open over that year, and also days to first service. We moved back to a synchronization-based program, and you'll kind of notice that the days, the voluntary waiting period has actually moved to 70 days. And as you look at, we'll see some data here later, our voluntary waiting period is now at 70. We find that we're getting pretty good fertility off of that. Phil had a question on how much increase in conception rate we need to have extra day per week in days to milk at first service. How much increase in conception rate would we need to have by extra day per week? That one, Phil, you might have to explain that one a little bit more to me. I'll let you type back in if you can explain a little bit more, or someone can maybe pick up one on what Phil Cardoso is trying to get at there. And let me keep moving so we get through the PowerPoints as well. But let's see if you can come back in with a little better explanation on that one. Okay, so what are the keys to success? And by success here, I mean an efficient reproductive program. Maximizing that conception at first service. I mean, and that is really sort of what's going to help us get everything, I think, where we wanted to. It's kind of like first cutting a hay. I'm sure Dave Fisher talked about that 2 weeks ago when he had his webinar. Making that first cutting of hay is going to set everything up for the rest of the summer. And the same thing happens here as we talk about reproduction. The more that we get pregnant on first service, the better off we're going to be. Now, there's a caveat to that, though, too, because you don't want to significantly delay the time to first service. I'm going to show you some data here in a minute that we get much better conception rates the later that we wait. But the problem with that is that you have fewer cows that are pregnant at the time being that you want them to. So there's some issues with delaying first service. And if you're doing that just to have a better conception rate, to make you feel good about your conception rate, there's going to be some significant repercussions on the total herd reproduction if you're just waiting a long time so you can, say, have a 50 or 55% conception rate on first service. Obviously, we'd like to have that even in earlier lactations, and I'm going to show you what we've been doing lately at the university herd, and we've been getting 45, 50% first service conception rate. And the nice thing with that is obviously then there's fewer cows in the breeding herd because most of them are getting pregnant on first service. Phil, I haven't seen you come back in with, oh, here we go. If you increase the voluntary waiting period, let's say from 50 to 60, how much better my conception rate needs to be to increase, have the same pregnancy rate, or do I have the same number of cows pregnant? That's going to take a little bit of calculations. I got an idea what you're talking about there because, one thing is, like I mentioned, we were at a 60-day voluntary waiting period, and we moved to 70, and we probably gained about 5 to 7% on our first service conception rate. So for us, that was enough of a bump to accept the extra 10 days on the voluntary waiting period because we had a much nicer increase in conception rate. And so sometimes it's just finding that sweet spot on where that voluntary waiting period fits for your herd. I do find that I think if people are breeding cows too early, the cow's reproductive tract just doesn't seem to be ready. And so they struggle a little bit with first service fertility because they're breeding the cows in that 45 to 50, even up to 60-day range. Well, I think we'll get to the next slide here, which will talk about some of those. Yep, here we go. So if you look at the relationship of days in milk to first service conception rate, this is some data that Jim Ferguson out of Pennsylvania summarized. But you're looking at, now this doesn't factor in the voluntary waiting period, so this just factors in when cows were bred on first service based on their days in milk. So you notice there's about a 32% conception rate if you breed cows less than 40 days in milk, a little bit of an increase at 41 to 60, but we really don't get the marked increase until we start waiting till about 60 days after calving. And you can see it's pretty well flat. From 60 to 120 days, maybe a little bit of a bump after 120 days in milk at first service. And then over 140 days, you're looking at 47%. So, you know, it sort of ties back into the concept that the more estrus cycles a cow has before you actually breed her the first time, the higher that fertility rate's going to be. We do know we need to have good CL function. From a hormonal standpoint, we need to make sure we got good progesterone levels, and so those are some of the important things to get these cows pregnant as well. And having estrus cycles gives us the ability for the cow to get through that. The question is do you want to wait 140 days to breed all your cows just to achieve that 45, 47% conception rate? And I think what I'll show you in our data is that we're waiting at 70 days right now. We're achieving that 45 to up to 50% first service conception rate, and we're waiting at 70 days. That all through a synchronization program. So I think as we look through the data, we'll be able to sort of show that and summarize. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually I've even sort of paired out from that red arrow on, so basically April of 2005 on, I was able to collect enough of the data, the conception data on first service to be able to look at the differences. So I'm going to basically take from this red arrow over, and this is what we're going to expand and look at from the different programs that we attempted at the U of I. So here is the same, that section from that red arrow over, and I'm going to show you the different programs that we attempted then during those period of time. So we started in October 2005. We've been doing this pre-sync, off-sync with 33-day. We were resyncing the cows 33 days after that first service. And that went on from October 2005 up until, you know, about November of 2006. And then at that point in time, we started using that cherry picking. So we were breeding off the pre-syncs. Any cows that didn't conceive off pre-sync, off of the pre-sync prostaglandin, or did get serviced off the pre-sync prostaglandin, we off-synced the cows that had no heats, and then we again followed with a 33-day resync on all those cows. Notice that's the time period that our days to first service increased, and intentionally so. We didn't want to breed any cows earlier than 60 days, so that first prostaglandin injection wasn't given until 57, 58 days in milk, so that her first heat would happen after 60 days. And you notice there was a corresponding increase in days open in the herd at that point in time. Shortly after that, that was when you saw some of the work out of Wisconsin, Michigan State, Paul Fricke and Milo Wiltbank and Richard Pursley talking about this double off-sync program. We tried that for about, I think, 17 weeks and found that it was just very labor intensive, not very efficient for us. And so then we've sort of adapted the G7G program. We adapted that into the Precinct program. And we've been using this program now for a little over 2 years. It'll be 2 years in May. And we're seeing really good success with a Precinct program followed by what we're going to call G7G. So it's 7 days instead of 6 days apart. I know it doesn't fit with the physiologists quite what they're looking for, but it certainly is fairly effective for us. And it puts us, and I'll explain why in a minute, why we're doing it on 7 days, because the days of the week that you have to give shots is really important, and the amount of time it takes for someone to go out there several days a week versus 1 or 2 days a week is really a big difference. Okay, so let's understand the Offsync protocol, just in case there's some of you that are online here that don't have a good concept of what the Offsync protocol is about. We're starting with an injection of GnRH, and 7 days later they're going to get an injection of prostaglandin. And then anywhere from, depending on the program, 48 to 72 hours later, they're going to get another injection of GnRH, followed by breeding that cow either co-sync, which would be 0 hours, so at the same time as the GnRH injection, or up to 24 hours later. Optimally, Richard Pursley shows, his data showed around 12 to 16 hours is the optimal time to breed cows after that second GnRH injection. Now, understanding why we're giving each of these shots is also very important. That first injection of GnRH is given to make sure that we ovulate any follicle and start a new follicular wave. So this is basically Milo Wilbank's data. I don't know that we get 100% of the cows starting a new follicular wave, but it's a fairly high proportion, at least 95 and probably closer to 99% of the cows, as long as they're cycling and they're not anovulatory, will start a new follicular wave by giving an injection of GnRH. The prostaglandin injection is given for what prostaglandin normally is given for, is to regress any corpus luteum that's on there. So we want to make sure we remove the progesterone influence from the cow at that point in time. Now, the timing between that prostaglandin and GnRH injection is important because the longer the time that follicle has in the last few hours of its growth, the bigger the follicle is, the better the fertility is, within a rule of thumb. And once it gets cystic, then it's too big. But that second injection of GnRH is then given to make sure that we ovulate, and that ovulation is typically going to occur 24 to 28 hours after that injection if the cow wasn't already going to ovulate on her own. So that's another important thing to think about when we think about success with Offsync, is that some cows are going to ovulate on their own just through their own hormonal influences. This GnRH injection is an insurance policy to make sure that the cow ovulates. Okay, it's best if we start this Offsync protocol when the cow is between day 5 and 12 of the cycle. That would tell us that there's going to be some progesterone or functional corpus luteum that's secreting progesterone during that time frame. And that's where we get our best results. Just blindly going in and starting Offsync on a group of cows and not knowing where they're at is going to be a recipe for success, not a recipe for success, but a recipe for failure, and at least not as good of results that you'd like to have. So we expect to get about 90% synchronization of ovulation in these cows if we do this Offsync protocol properly. So let's just sort of take a look at these follicular waves and how the estrus cycle kind of works. If we look at the ovulation occurring on day 0, so here we have the purple is a dominant follicle that's ovulated, and then that's going to go ahead and build into what starts out as a corpus hemorrhagicum, but then into a corpus luteum, and P4 indicates that corpus luteum would be secreting progesterone. And then it basically has a lifespan, and eventually then by day 21 it's no longer functional, it's no longer secreting progesterone, primarily because the uterus then would secrete prostaglandin F2 alpha on its own and start a new cycle. Now, meanwhile, we've got a follicular wave that's going to start, and you have sort of a first wave follicle that's going to become dominant, but because of the influence of progesterone from this corpus luteum, it's going to regress, or that follicle is going to turn over and it's no longer going to go on to dominance. By day 10, this will be a typical 2-wave follicular wave cycle in a cow. You see that second follicular wave going on to dominance, and because the progesterone level from that CL starts to decline after the natural release of prostaglandin, you're going to get that second wave dominant follicle is going to go on to ovulation. This is the typical 2-wave cycle of a cow. Now, when we're applying that to Offsync, we want to make sure we start the Offsync protocol between day 5 and 12. And ideally, I like to try and start it right around here on that 5 to 6. The earlier, the better. And you can start it all the way out to day 12, but we're trying to hit somewhere in that sweet spot, basically between day 5 and day 12. So if we sort of match up the hormones to the reproductive cycle and look at how those hormones are working as far as within the ovaries, the GnRH injection is used to then start a follicular wave. The prostaglandin is given to make sure that we lyse that CL and regress it so that it's no longer secreting progesterone, so that that dominant follicle can go on to ovulation. The GnRH on day 9 is given to force the ovulation, and then we fit that timed AI in there sometime around day 10, or co-sync would be on day 9 as well. But again, I think we can see better fertility if we actually move that on into a 12 to 16 hour range afterward. Okay, Now, this is obviously going to come through probably a little bit on the fine side, but I wanted to talk about the different protocols that we used in the what was in the graph earlier. So here's the Precinct Offsync Protocol that we used basically from January 2003 through December 2006. We were giving our first injections of prostaglandin 33 to 39 days in milk. 2 weeks later, they would get another injection of prostaglandin. 12 days later, we would start Offsync. So if they had a heat off this second prostaglandin shot, which they should have, they would have been starting Offsync at about day 8 of the cycle. And that's sort of ideally between that day 5 and 12. Prostaglandin a week later, GnRH 2 days later, and then time day I, basically 69 to 57 or 75 days in milk and first service. And that's what we had been using for good 2.5, 3 years on our time breeding program. At some point in time, we said, let's see what would happen if we actually tried to use more heat detection. So they didn't get their first prostaglandin injection until 60 to 66 days in milk. They basically, if they had a heat, they were bred, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of that week. The following week, if they didn't get bred or get service, they were given another injection of prostaglandin. We watched for heat, bred any cows that had heat, and then any of those cows that didn't come into heat and get bred, then were started on Offsync basically 12 days later, or about day 8 of the cycle, assuming that these were silent heats, that we did get to see them to have heats. And then we moved on. Their first time day I occurred at 96 to 102 days. So it's very obvious why our days open increased is because we delayed that first service, and not too many cows were bred off that first prostaglandin injection. Actually, most of them have showed their best heat off the second prostaglandin injection. Okay. After February 2008, for a couple of weeks, 17 weeks, we tried the double Offsync program. You'll notice that you're given shots on a Sunday, so that really didn't work out for us very well. So what we did, because of the differences in how we were giving those injections, we actually moved to this, what we're going to call this Precinct G7G. So you'll notice that Mondays we're giving prostaglandin. Wednesdays, we're palpating cows, giving GnRH or prostaglandin. We try and do those in the morning on a Wednesday. Fridays, we're only giving GnRH to the group of cows that are going to be bred, and that we're usually shooting for about 56 to 60 hours after these PGF shots are given. And then the next morning, we're breeding cows. And as I said, we've eventually moved our days in milk for first service, voluntary waiting period, back to 70 days. For a while there, and in some of the data you'll see, it was at 60 days. But since then, we've moved it to 70 days, and actually we're even getting another, as I mentioned, Phil, we've got another bump, about 5 to 7% conception rate on first service just by moving it back 10 days. And I'm willing to accept that delay for that increase in conception, especially if you move from 40 to 47 or 45 to 50, and that's really been what we've been seeing. Just as just so you understand the G6G protocol that's there, a prostaglandin injections given. 3 days later, we give GnRH to make sure that that cow ovulates, so that we've got a good CL to start Offsync for 6 days later after that GnRH. So G, 6 days later GnRH, and then you follow through with the Offsync protocol. We moved this date back mainly because so we didn't have to give shots on 4 days a week, and we're only giving them on 3 days a week. And actually, again, like I said, we've been seeing pretty good success. From January 2004, then basically any cow that comes in 33 days after breeding, so all these breedings that are occurring on Saturday, the cows are going to be 33 days on a Wednesday. Those cows would receive GnRH if they're open. They don't receive anything if they're pregnant. 40 days, they get their prostaglandin, and then they follow on with the resync protocol. So it fits in very well with our Wednesday herd check. Now, if you do a herd check on a different day of the week, you can obviously move everything over, shift it, but then the prostaglandin and the GnRH shots need to shift as well. Okay, so let's look at the summary of the data then. So these are results of the different synchronization protocols that were implemented at the U of I farm. Roughly 280 cows, including the dry cows, from October 2005 through really October 2009 from a breeding date. And we were confirming those breedings pregnant then in December, and that's what I was able to summarize for you in the data. For about 68 weeks, we used that I summarized data. We were using it actually longer than that before that time, but I actually only went back for 68 weeks, 220 services, 83 pregnancies, so about 38% conception risk using, this is all first service, by the way, so this doesn't include any of the resyncs. You guys still hearing me? I see we had a volume loss. Mike, we're good?
I got you, Dick. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dave. Okay, good enough.
I'm hearing you.
All right, very good. Let's just sort of look at that 68 weeks of the Precinct Offsync program, average 72 days in milk at first service. You know, there were about 65 different breeding days in those 68 weeks, and we were breeding about 3.4 cows, first service cows, per week. That's important when we start talking about efficiency here. Well, we went to the cherry picking program. We did that for 65 weeks. There was 117 first services in the cherry picking program. So this is just the Precinct prostaglandins and breeding off of those. You'll notice here, this is the Offsync group. So these 65 weeks are the same weeks. But there was 117 that were cherry picked. There were 25 that rolled on into the Offsync program. About 44% of the cows were pregnant. So we actually did see an increase in first service conception risk in the cows that we cherry picked, which we expected. That was one of the things we were trying to achieve. But you'll notice that we increased our days to first service by 12 days, and we were breeding on 105 different days during those 65 weeks, or about 1.1 cows per day, first service cows. So we ended up doing a lot more, like if you look at the labor of breeding cows, we were breeding cows all days of the week, and we had to make sure there was someone there that could breed cows. And then these 48%, which I didn't really expect. I expected that we would clean the most fertile cows off in the cherry picking approach, and we would have less fertile cows here. But we actually had about 48%. It's a very small number, 12 out of 25. But days in first service for those cows, 103 days. 15 days, different breeding days for about 2 cows per day on those. Double Offsync, we only did that for about 17 weeks. Didn't really work well for us from a timing standpoint. We had about 38%. Now, I don't know if we gave it a fair enough shake or not, but it was basically comparable to our Precinct program. A little bit more injections, but we actually did fairly well, I think, reasonably well with the double Offsync. Then you'll notice here I've summarized data for the 77 weeks that we've been using this Precinct G7G. That's about 300 services, almost 140 pregnancies, 47.5% conception risk, 70 days in milk at first service, about 65 different breeding days in those 77 weeks. Now, 65 days would be just cows that had first service. Again, remember, so there's some days there we didn't breed any first service cows in our 77 weeks, but when you look at it, there were 65 different breeding days, almost 4 cows per day. So efficiency from a breeding standpoint really spelled out. Well, how do these data then look at it on a statistical basis? Is there a statistical difference between those different conception risks, I guess? And if we take a look and compare the Precinct program, Leo, yes, those are all first services. So these are only first services that I counted in this data set. So if we look at the Precinct versus cherry picking, 38% versus 46%, well, there was no significant difference primarily because of the number of animals that we had. And obviously, we weren't doing this as a research project. We just retrospectively went back and said, okay, how many cows can we pick up that were in each of these programs on first service? Precinct, Offsync versus that cherry picking, again, there's only 25 services and 12 pregnancies, so no difference there. Comparing it to the double Offsync, well, there's really almost no numerical difference between the two conception risks, and there was no difference there. But we did see a significant difference between the Precinct Offsync program that we traditionally used and this Precinct G7G. 37 to 47, we had about a 10% increase. So it was significantly different and significantly better to use the Precinct G7G than that traditional Precinct Offsync program. You'll also see between double Offsync and the Precinct G7G that those two were also significantly different. But again, we only did that for about 17 weeks. So I'm not sure we gave it a full shake, but it just wasn't working logistically in our herd. So we had to do something different. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the Precinct G7G program and why that I find it actually for our herd fairly efficient, and that's one of the things we talked about, efficient and obviously successful as well. The Precinct shots, the Precinct PGF shots are only given on one day of the week. So when you take, you have a group of cows that you give shots to, you're only giving the fresh cows prostaglandin shots on, in our case, on a Monday. So that you're only taking one hormone out. So you only need to have, one bottle, one list, one, person given shots, and they don't have to determine which injection do they get that day, because on Mondays they're all getting prostaglandin. Then let's go to the Friday or the GnRH day. Okay, so on Friday you're only giving those pre-breeding GnRH shots. You're taking, again, only one hormone out on Fridays, and it's only the cows that are going to be bred. So there's really only a few cows that are going to be getting shots on that Friday. We do end up grouping the cows that get resynced. So they're, you probably could have more than just first service cows, because they'll get their GnRH shot as well. But still, it's only the breeding group. And in our 200 cow herd, that's going to be in a range of 8 to 12 cows a week that's going to get bred. Okay, then you have pregnancy assessment day, and that's what we call that's our Wednesday, and that's our preg check day or herd check. So you really need to make sure you have somebody there that can for sure determine if a cow is 40 days open or 40 days pregnant. That is a must, because that's the day the cow's going to get prostaglandin, and if you can't determine that, then this system is not going to work for you. I know that some farms are trying to use the blood test now, the bioprint blood test. Well, you could actually pull that blood on the 33 day, give her an injection of GnRH, and then follow up with that information. But I still feel a lot more comfortable either scanning the cows or palpating the cows and confirming before I give that prostaglandin injection to the pregnant cows. That pregnancy assessment day is also important, because you're going to be given GnRH injections and prostaglandin injections that day. So it's important that you have somebody out there with a little more sophistication that can make the determination, is this cow on the PGF list or on the GnRH list. So you do need to have a little better control, but you only need to have that control one day a week. And I know larger herds that actually do, one side of the farm, one pen of 800 cows or 4 to 800 cows one day of the week, and another pen the other day of the week. So you could actually group it up that way as well. So if we take a look at a calendar view of this Precinct G7G program, this is basically how we set it up based on days in milk. Mondays, cows that are 38 to 44 days in milk get their first injection of prostaglandin. And then the next Monday, you're going to have another group of cow that's 38 to 44 days, another group the next Monday, and it just continues to follow through. So you just basically take the group of cows that have that week. If they're 38 to 44, they get their first injection of prostaglandin. 2 weeks later, that group gets a second injection of prostaglandin, followed by on Wednesday, they get a GnRH injection. Here's where the G7G comes in. And the reason we give this GnRH injection is to make sure we get an ovulation off of this heat that we just attempted to create by lysing the CL. And I really don't care how big that CL is. Some people say you need to wait till Thursday to give this because you'll get a bigger CL. We've found that as long as we can create a CL from this ovulation, and that CL is now going to be about 6 days old by the time we start Offsync, they are very fertile as far as the way we get them going. So then we start the Offsync at 61 days, prostaglandin a week later, GnRH on Friday. So this is in the morning. This prostaglandin is given at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. These are given in the afternoon at 5 to 6 p.m. And then Saturday morning we breed the cows. And it works out fairly well for us to get cows pregnant. So let's talk about in the last, 22 minutes, I guess, a little bit about how we assess the success of this program. And one of the ways we've looked at this now is this 21-day preg rate. So hopefully many of you are very comfortable with this value, but I want to go through a little bit of review for those that may not be. What we would consider an excellent 21-day pregnancy rate is about a 28 to 35%. For people that work with beef cattle, they look at these things, these numbers, and they say, you guys can't survive with those kind of pregnancy rates. But we're not looking at one whole breeding season worth of pregnancy rate. We're looking at a rolling 21-day period of time. So it's looking at the cows that are eligible to be pregnant in a 21-day period of time and the ones that get pregnant. And that's where this 21-day pregnancy rate comes from. If you have pregnancy rates in that 28 to 35%, it's going to allow for some voluntary culling, maybe be able to sell some dairy replacements or expand the herd internally. We would consider a good 21-day pregnancy rate anything between 20 and 27%. At this kind of a rate, you probably can maintain a static herd size and maybe do some voluntary culling based on cows that just kick or don't look good or whatever. You might have a reason for getting rid of a cow. Average pregnancy rates are less than 20%, and if you look at this is a slide from, I think, Steve Stewart summarized some data out of Minnesota, and the average is somewhere around 13-14% pregnancy rate in Minnesota herds. Maybe that's gone up in some time. This is kind of a little bit older of a data set, but probably going to need to purchase cattle to maintain herd size, and voluntary culling will be next to impossible with those kind of pregnancy rates. And I guess the question I get asked fairly often is, is that 28-day, is that pregnancy rate, up around 27, 28 days, is that really realistic, and is it achievable? So we need to sort of take a look at how these 21-day pregnancy rates are calculated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a group of cows, and say it's a 100-cow herd, and we're going to look at every estrus cycle after the voluntary waiting period. So the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth estrus cycle after the voluntary waiting period. We're going to make an assumption that we've got an average conception rate across the herd of 40%. And we're going to assume that we have about a 40% heat detection rate. With those kind of values, the first 100 cows that would come up to the voluntary waiting period, 40% of them would be detected in heat. That's our 40% heat detection rate. And then 40% of those cows would become pregnant with a 40% conception rate. So there's 16 pregnant cows in that first estrus cycle after the voluntary waiting period, leaving 84 cows open for the next estrus cycle. And so that's going to just continue down through. And basically we would have, in theory, a 16% pregnancy rate at each one of these cycles. And so our rolling 21-day pregnancy rate would be basically 16%. Now let's take a look at that. First let's summarize that, I guess. So after the sixth estrus cycle, 21-day estrus cycle after the voluntary waiting period, we'd have about 65% of the cows pregnant, but you still have a third of the cows that are not pregnant. And that would leave us about 18% of the cows still open if we extend this out to 10 heat cycles after the voluntary waiting period. And usually after 10 estrus cycles, you're looking at those are probably going to be reproductive culls because they've been bred multiple times, or they haven't shown enough heat, or their production levels are low enough that they're not going to get serviced. Okay, let's make an assumption that we can improve our heat detection rate by 10 percentage points, up to 50%. How does that do as far as increasing us on our pregnancy rate? Well, that should give us a 20% pregnancy rate if we could increase it, and our conception rate is still at 40%. Now we've got almost 3/4 of the cows pregnant by the sixth estrus cycle, and we only have about 11% of the cows open 10 cycles after the voluntary waiting period. Now you can all argue about whether 40% is achievable, whether you see that on your farms or not. From a conception rate standpoint, you can also argue about that 50% heat detection rate. Certainly, we have a much more difficult time finding 50% of the cows in natural heats, at least on our setting, especially with cows on concrete a lot, and don't have any pasture, any dirt, or anything for them to get out on. Let's look at what would happen in a Offsync program where you have 100% of the cows then are serviced on the first service. And we're going to still hang on to that 40% conception rate, but after that, we're going to still come back and detect heat at about 40% of the time. So in the first cycle, you're going to have your pre-sync, off-sync. In your second cycle, it's all going to have to be heat detection for the open cows that were off-synced. By the third cycle, you're going to have a group of cows that are going to get resynced, but then you're going to have another group of cows that we got to do heat detection from the previous heats that were detected. So it gets a little bit complicated, but when we start looking at this and start to summarize the pregnancy rates, the first service is going to be, it should be about a 40% pregnancy rate on the first cycle. And then we go into the estrus detection, so only 16%. Then we've got this combined cycle where part of it's 40% and part of it's 16%, so the average is going to be about 32%. So overall, we should be able to shoot for about a 21-day pregnancy rate if we're doing a good job of both heat detection and pre-sync service and getting cows pregnant on that first service. So I guess, is it achievable? 24 looks like that's fairly achievable. With this kind of a program, 84% of the cows will be pregnant by 6 services, and we'll only have about 6% of the cows open at 10 cycles. And that's getting to the point where I think we've got a fairly successful, efficient reproductive program about getting cows pregnant. I guess I didn't think I had this one in here. This is just moving conception rate up to 50%, and it would show us to have about a 32. So you're trying to get a 32% program using some kind of a synchronized timed AI program, you're going to need to get up around 50% conception rate and still maintain that 40% heat detection rate on cows that don't have estrus cycles. So, that being said, I think 32% is achievable, but not probably as easy as we think. 94% of the cows would be pregnant by the 6th service, and only 3% of the cows would be open at 10 cycles after the voluntary waiting period. So this is kind of the ideal. If you want to try and shoot for that, that's a pretty big goal. Well, another way that we can look at these 21-day pregnancy rates is looking at them on a survival curve. And so if you take a look at this graph, what we have on the x-axis is the days post-calving. And you'll notice that over here on the right side is 10 estrus cycles after the voluntary waiting period, or about 210 days after, say, the voluntary waiting period is around 60 days. On the y-axis is the percent of cows open. So by survival means that 100% of the cows are open from calving until the voluntary waiting period, and then we start getting cows pregnant. And they start falling off, and the more cows that are pregnant, by the time we get to 10 heat cycles, the fewer that we'll have for reproductive culls. So this black line is basically what we would consider a 15% pregnancy rate, and you could achieve that with, say, 39% heat detection and 38% conception rate. The green line would be where we'd have to have 100% heat detection rate or service rate, say in an Offsync program with resyncs, and about a 45% conception rate would give us this 45% and only 3% open. So that's how it's setting up the next few graphs that we're going to look at. So just in summary, I want to go back through and look at the reproductive programs that we used on the U of I herd between October 2005 and October 2009 for basically these 4 years. Remember, early on, we were using a Precinct Offsync program with the resyncs. In the middle there, we went to cherry picking those prostaglandin estruses off of those Precinct shots, and then Offsync any cow that didn't show heat. Then we tried a double Offsync for a little while, and then we did the Precinct G7G. So I want to kind of go through. We're going to basically look at before we started this Precinct program, we were all heat detection. Then we're going to look at this program. Then we're going to look at the cherry picking, and then we're going to look at, again, how we've been doing with the G7G program. So in 2002, this is before we started any synchronization programs, this is what the survival curve looked like at the U of I herd. Basically, we had 299 cows that were eligible for first service from 60 days to 81 days, and only about 7.5% of them were getting pregnant in that first interval, 11% in the next interval, 9%, 6%. You can notice there's a lot of cows in the breeding pool because we're not getting as many cows pregnant. So each one of these intervals then is a 21-day cycle. By the time we get to 210 days after the voluntary waiting period, we had nearly 50% of the herd was still open at 270 days in milk. So this is why we needed to do something different. It was just not getting the cows done by using all estrus detection to basically get cow service. 2 years later, after we'd started our Precinct Offsync program, followed by resyncs, you'll see that we got almost 25% of them pregnant in the first service. And then there's a heat detection period, and then there's the resync, and then another heat detection period, and then a resync, and then pretty much it sort of starts to fall out there. But you'll notice that the timed programs had the highest pregnancy rates for those 21-day intervals. We also reduced the number of cows that are in the breeding pool fairly quickly because you're getting more and more cows pregnant sooner. Still had about 17% of the cows that were open after that 210 day after the voluntary waiting period. Okay, 2007 brings on when we went to the cherry picking program, and if you notice, it looks very similar to what happened with our 2002 data when we were all heat detection. So first service was really heat based, but then we were using resyncs and Offsync on any cow that didn't get bred off that first service. But boy, look, our survival curve really flattened out in those first 3 services as we were trying to get cows coming through prostaglandin and detect them in heat. Some could say that we did a poor job detecting heat. That's probably the case. You'll notice in this interval here, this is when we started the Offsync program. So you're getting more cows pregnant there, and you were able to move these cows through. So thinking we were trying to get a better job at first service conception, which we did, we weren't getting a more efficient reproductive program because we still had 36% of the herd that was open at 210 days after the voluntary weaning period. Here's where we're at in 2009. You'll notice that first service, we got 36% pregnant. Then there's a heat detection period, only 5% pregnant out of those 100 cows. Resync, 34%, then a heat detection period, and then almost 45% pregnant of those 54 cows. So you can see that really started to improve at a point where now we're only 5.4% of the herd were open after 10 cycles after the voluntary weaning period. So, we're again talking about efficiency and talking about success, and I guess I would look at this as a very successful reproductive program. Granted, we are having to use a fair bit of hormones to get the job done. Many of you are used to looking at some of these bred sums or preg rate reports in PC Dart. This one is listed this is as of December of 2005. You'll notice that in the cows that were 63 to 83 days in milk, that was our first service. You notice there's 42%. The next interval, only 5% preg rate, and that's not very many cows are bred in that time period, but 4 pregnancies out of 8 observed breeding, so about a 50% conception rate on those heats that were detected. Then we went to 32% in the next resync cycle, 36 in the next one. So overall, we were shooting about 25% after a year and a half of this program. I wanted to give you one last update of where we're at currently. I made this one up this morning, so this is actually where we're at as of March of 2010 through, I think, February 20th breeding dates, if I got it right. So this is through February 20th breeding dates that were confirmed as of March 31st. You'll notice that we're over 40% on first service. Almost 42% of those cows are pregnant on first service. There's our heat detection interval. 34% pregnant on the resync. Another heat detection interval. 46% on the third resync. And we're shooting at about 6% of cows are open at 10 cycles after the voluntary weaning period. You notice that we're down to only 4 cows left to breed in our 220, 250 cow herd. Out here at these longer days in milk. So really a very successful program from that standpoint as far as where we're shooting. If we take a look at the preg rate report, here it is again based on days in milk. As I said before, 45% there on that first service, 37% on resync, and then another 39 on that third resync. And after that, we usually sort of scatter things out, either cedar them or do something different if they're still open and we're still challenged with trying to get them pregnant. I think this might be the last slide, or second to last slide. This is how we typically look at the bred sum report based on days, based on the date. So this is the last date of a 21-day interval. And so you get a little idea on where we're at coming out of the summer. We were still hitting 21, 25%, over 20% coming out of the summer, although this summer was very mild, I have to admit to that. You do see a couple of cows that lost those pregnancies, so we lost about 10 of those confirmed pregnancies. But here we ran into a 43% window, and so currently we're running about a 27% 21-day preg rate, which gets it up into that above average to hopefully excellent range, and hopefully we're seeing an improvement from there. Okay, with that, that leaves us about 7 minutes, and I'm glad to see we had, looks like 29 on and off throughout the day, almost 30 come on to the webinar series. I'd be happy to answer any questions. We have Dr. Hutchins and Dave Fisher online as well. So again, if there's some interest in popping some questions to either of those two, be happy to respond to any questions we have as we finish up our lunch hour. Dr. Mike, you got anything?
Well, basically, Dick, at this point, not really. What is the cost of this program per cow? Have you ever looked at that?
Yeah, we have. If you look at GnRH, it's probably in the neighborhood of $2.50, and prostaglandin probably about the same, $2, $2.25, $2.50. So each injection is going to be about $2.50 if you throw the labor in there. I've kind of factored it in a couple different ways, and it really depends on how much value you put on a pregnancy and how much value you put on a pregnancy when you want that cow pregnant. So let's say by 115 days, so you have a 13-month calving interval. So if you look at what the cost is per day open after 115 days, and you want to put $2 a day into that thing, I think we can make these numbers play out. So I guess the full Precinct G7G program would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 injections, so 6 times 250. So we're looking at about $15 for the hormones, not to mention the labor to give those injections. And we're still got to breed cows, so the semen cost is basically the same. One of the things we've noticed, obviously, when you get more cows pregnant sooner, you're using a lot less semen too. So that's coming in there pretty well. Leo's got a number here. Question. Oh, what happened to Leo's question? Can these numbers be achieved without a synchronization program? Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, Leo, I've never seen a herd that's been able to do that, but that doesn't mean I haven't been around enough either. I know I struggled with clients when I was in practice up in Wisconsin, convincing them they got to do a better job heat detecting. And it wasn't until I actually was responsible for getting a herd pregnant that it's not as easy of a task as we try and convince producers that it is to do. When you're the one out there doing it, I would venture to say, if I talked to our herd manager, Travis Michaels, and even Mark Sauter, one of our breeders, it's very convenient to go out there one day a week and basically breed cows. One of the interesting things is I'm breeding cows every day on a Saturday, that cows that are bred 21 days before that, if they are showing heat, typically they're hanging out with the cows that are getting Offsync. So, there's a little bit of benefit there to be out there at the time when they should be coming back into heat. So, to be honest, I don't think we can achieve these kind of numbers without a synchronization program, but maybe I'm shortcutting some people as far as their skills as far as detecting heat. It certainly is going to take a lot more effort to get out there and watch cows for heat. You're going to be breeding multiple days of the week. Some of those things, if you factor in that time factor as well, compared to the limited amount of time that we're putting into our reproductive program and getting this kind of success, I think you got to weigh those two. Ernie Krauser's got a comment: with the current economic situation so far, cheapen operations to try to save costs. Do you see any trend in reduced preg rates because of this? Boy, I'm going to toss that one to Dr. Hutchins. Yeah, I can certainly see where, yeah, you could have some big impacts on your reproductive rates if you take too much out of the ration. What have you seen there, Dr. Hutchins?
Yeah, Dick, I think it's a tough one. I'm like you. I'm not sure I'm close enough to enough farms to see it. Ernie, you might even be closer from that point. I would think it would be a negative. I'd be more nervous coming in from the mineral vitamin side of the equation, trying to cheat it up or cheapen it up, and or the fat side, which obviously, pulling fuzzy cottonseed out or pulling out roasted soybeans or taking some of the rumen inert fats out of it as far as that goes. I don't know. I guess I've not seen, Dick or Leo, any numbers in 2009. What is the reproductive trends and quote our good herds or base herds? U of I didn't change, so I'm not sure we can answer that question.
Yeah. Dan Head has a comment in here, a question. For repro failure measured by days in milk still open or number of services still open, determine culling. Just where are the verbs in that sentence there, Dan? Just trying to figure that out. Okay, failure by days in milk still open. Yeah, well, okay, I can see where you're saying there. If there's still 150 days in milk and still open, that would be a concern. Number of services and still open, that obviously is going to have an impact on days in milk unless you're breeding cows that aren't in heat to determine culling. Yeah, you could look at percent of cows still open after 150 days, and that could be another measure of reproductive success / failure. So there's certainly other ways to measure that. The reason I like the 21-day pregnancy rate is that it's very contemporary. As long as we're updating the information on a regular basis, it gives us a much better picture of whether we're having reproductive success or failure, because those are the cows, the cows that are eligible to be bred and serviced and made pregnant are listed in there. Just looking at one static number, say percent of cows still open after 150 days, or number of services, 8 services and still open, that makes it a little bit tougher to make that decision on a herd-wide basis. For an individual cow, certainly, that's going to be a problem in there. Phil has is there a good formula of nutrition program by fresh or early lactation cow diets that can help the reproductive program? I'll turn that one over to Dr. Hutchins, and then I'll
Well,
read
yeah,
Leo's
very,
question.
very, very briefly, Phil. I think you're going to be looking at what I call a really good micronutrient program. I'd be in there. Anything I can do to help get energy into these cows, maintain dry matter intakes, I think are going to be a plus as well. And if I'm rich and famous like Leo Timms, then I would probably look at some of the inert fats. I think the inert fats are there. My problem is, boy, the cost of those get to be always challengeable when we have our current milk prices. So to me, it's anything to drive energy, dry matter intake, and my micronutrients, Dick.
Great. And Leo's got a comment here looking at the annualized preg rates on dairy metrics. They increased in 2009, and he's making the assumption, which probably rightly so, is related to the nice summer that we had. Probably those numbers are going to fall back to previous. Yeah, certainly, Leo, we're going to be watching that number very closely as we go through this next summer. Hopefully, we got another mild summer as well. We could use that from a milk price and a profitability standpoint. We can't use a disastrous hot summer that's going to really clobber our milk production because we're all struggling from a financial standpoint to get through this.
Dick, I'm not sure this is related to Dan's question, but at what point do we take the cow and say we're not going to breed her anymore? I mean, we're out 180 days and she's open. Do I stop breeding that cow? I know that's going to bugger up your statistics, but is there a guideline to say eventually you just stop breeding?
Yeah, it actually doesn't really bugger the statistics up because at least in both PC Dart and Dairy Comp, when you designate that cow as a cull, you mark her do not breed or mark her as a cull cow, from then on, her reproductive information is no longer included in the data. So from an analysis standpoint, it really doesn't bugger it up that much because those cows are then excluded after you designate them a cull. All the breedings up until that point, though, are included because you were attempting to get that cow pregnant. Now, when does that decision occur? I think that's really going to depend on the herd and the interest in the producer and sticking around with a cow. You know as well as I do, we got some cows in our herd that we probably breed a little longer than we should. If they got a rumen cannula in them, they're a good research cow. They're still producing milk. So there's some decisions that you're going to make on that individual cow if she's on her 5th or 6th or even 4th or 5th service. We've got a couple cows that after the 3rd service, if they don't get pregnant, we don't even try again because we know that, hey, she even after maybe the 2nd service, or we'll even give them 1 service. If she didn't get pregnant on 1st service, she's done. And we've got reasons for that. She could be a chronically lame cow, a high cell count cow. Who knows what the reasons are. But I think that's all going to kind of be determined on an individual basis. And, as we get to larger herds, that's really probably going to be factored in, pretty much regularly looking at, which cows do we pull out of the breeding pool. And that's going to have to be a decision between the herd manager, the owner, and the consultants that are there at the farm. What is the time you pull the trigger? We certainly aren't going to breed a cow back if she's down to 20 pounds of milk and she's had 8 services. I mean, we're not going to even keep trying on her. Hopefully, we haven't gotten to that far on her. But some herds, they will keep breeding those cows, and I guess it never hurts to sell a cow if she's pregnant. So I guess you can always do that too. So, but I wouldn't put the hormones in her. I wouldn't put the extra cost. It gets to the point now where it's heat detection only, or just letting her fly. Okay. Well, we're at 103, and Tabitha, you got one question there. How does milk production affect setting? High count, high production. Settling. Oh, I'm sorry. Milk production affects settling. Yeah, that's an interesting question. We've got a cow at the U of I. She peaked at 180 pounds of milk, and we got her pregnant on the 1st service at roughly 72 days. So I'm really not. I don't think you have to say that a cow given a high amount of milk is going to have an effect on her ability to reproduce. It's her ability to cycle that's really the most important thing. And so as we go through our Precinct G7G program, there's a point in time in there where we're going to sleeve the cow and make sure that she is cycling to make sure that we're not just wasting the hormones on this cow. So if a high producing cow is not cycling, then you're not going to be successful. But as long as she's cycling, I really don't think that there's any big drawback to breeding cows that are producing high. High somatic cell count, that's kind of another issue. there are some data that look at reproduction and cell count as being an issue, but probably more related to the cow's immune function and some other issues is why she's got that high cell count. And again, we probably aren't going to breed cows that are chronic high cell count cows. We put them on our cull list pretty quick now, as we're trying to keep a cell count low. Okay, I don't want to keep anyone else here longer than you can, but I'm willing to stay and answer questions as long as I guess Jim's willing to leave the webinar open. So you guys at Home Central there, Mike and Jim and Dave, tell me when to shut up. Mark Beer has a question. What do you do with cows that show heat for 2 days after the last shot in the Offsync program? Yeah, wow. I would probably give her another injection of GnRH just to make sure that she ovulates, or that make sure that the injection was given properly after that last shot, because she should definitely stop. But remember, external signs of heat are basically interaction between progesterone and estrogen. So all that means is that she's got a fairly high level of estrogen. It doesn't mean she didn't ovulate. It doesn't mean that she's not going to conceive. It just means that she's actually carrying a little bit more estrogen in her system longer, and that's why she's probably showing the heat. I'd be a little bit concerned she might have gone cystic, but you know what? We really see fewer cystic cows now with our program, because we're using so much GnRH ahead of breeding that we get rid of a lot of our cystic cows that way. Tabitha, will this be downloadable to watch again later? Yes, I believe so. Mike, can you confirm that with Jim? This will be available for download, or at least to view later.
See it. Okay, I've got the mic. Jim says yes, it's going to be downloaded. And Jim, where's that going to be located at? You're going to send a message out to the participants of where it'll be downloaded. It'll probably take, what, an hour or two to get it downloaded? Yes, it will be downloaded.
So it should be out there and available for you, Tabitha.
Great. Well, Dick, I think excellent job. I think I see no more questions coming in at this point, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Dick, thanks very much for taking a busy noon hour out of your schedule here to join our group here. That completes our series of 3 webinars. Dave Fisher, thank you very much for participating in the previous one at this point. Where the future goes with the webinars, we're not quite sure. In fact, we might even be looking for some sponsorship. Again, everything is drying up here at the University of Illinois, so we may be looking at our 4-state conference, talking a little bit, some of the people asking if this is a useful role, and maybe we'll look at maybe some joint programming down in the future. With that, we'll stand adjourned. Dick, any comments, or Dave?
Nope, very good. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, very good. Folks, have a